Hello, family. I'm Robert David Call, son of Waldo, who was the son of Charlie, who was the son of Anson Bowen Call and Dora Pratt. It's an honor for me to retell this story of Grandpa Anson Bowen Call facing the firing squad. Bowen and his family moved to Mexico in December of 1890 and established their home in Colonia Dublin, where they lived peaceably for several years. In November of 1910, the Mexican Revolution began when Francisco Madero led an uprising to oust the dictator, President Porfirio Diaz. The revolution lasted for most of the decade because there were several different factions fighting against each other because they couldn't agree on policies and on each other. The colonists living in the church colonies in northern Mexico remained neutral, but the armies of the different factions plundered and stole horses and other farm animals and grain and hay and food and whatever they could take from the colonists. The situation got so dangerous in 1912 that in July there was a major exodus where most of the colonists left on the train to go to El Paso, Texas, and from there to other places in the United States. Teresa and Julia and the children went to Utah, where they stayed with Grandma Thompson and Grandma Ann Mariah Bowen Call, and so the children got to know their grandmothers. Bowen stayed in El Paso to help the people there and to wait until he could return to their home in Colonia Dublin, which he did in November of that year. On May 3rd, 1913, Bowen was summoned to Nuevo Casas Grandes to meet with General Salazar, who was calling in all the people around the country to talk to them about the abuses of the poor Chinamen. One of the prisoners whom Salazar had captured that day was taken out and stood in front of a wall in front of all the crowd and was shot by a firing squad. Of this experience, Bowen wrote, "I stood in full view of it all. I never can forget it. The sight still haunts me." The next day, Bowen wrote a letter to Elder Anthony W. Ivins of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, explaining the situation in the colonies at that time. Elder Ivins wrote back to Bowen and said, among other things, "I feel that you are all in great danger, but I believe the Lord approves of your course in trying to preserve and protect what you and others have there, and that He will protect you. You may be robbed, threatened, and put to every test possible for the adversary of righteousness to devise, but the Lord will spare your lives, and like Job of old, after it is all over, will multiply you manyfold to compensate you for your losses." Finally, at the end of June, Teresa, Julia, and the children, having been gone for 11 months, returned to Mexico to be back in Colonia Dublin. During the summer of 1913, one of the factions led by Pancho Villa and his army had control of the area, and they protected the colonists. But when they were gone to fight in other places, small bands of rebels called Red Flaggers came out of the mountains and plundered and looted and abused the colonists. In July, Jose Parra and his son led a small band of the Red Flaggers. They robbed and plundered Dublin. One morning, Parra was waiting on the steps of the Farnsworth and Romney store. He ordered Bowen to open the door. I told him I didn't have a key. He told me to get it. I started off walking slowly. Parra called to me to get a move on it, or he would hurry me in a different way. When I got back, Parra went behind the counters and took whatever he wanted. As soon as word of these outrages reached Pancho Villa in Ascension, he sent an officer named Talamantes with 400 men in pursuit of the Red Flaggers. Talamantes surprised Jose Parra's band at Casas Grandes. Parra and his son were captured and executed on the spot. To minimize the theft of horses, several families in Dublin took their horses into the mountains whenever they learned a rebel group was approaching. Anson Bowen Jr. mentioned in his autobiography, it was a lot of fun for them. We took our guns and hunted deer while we were out there. My grandfather, Charles Helaman Call, relates, we never knew when Villa, the Red Flaggers, or other armies would come. We would run into soldiers everywhere we went. They took our horses, pigs, and chickens. Harold Pratt and I took our horses to the mountains to hide them, and we stayed so long in the mountains that Dad sent someone to find us. We hunted and had a good time up near Cave Valley. Grandpa Bowen turned 50 years old in October of 1913. On Friday, November 14th, 6 Red Flaggers rode to Bowen's home. They wanted hay, corn, and a place to stay the night. Their leader was Tomas Perez. One of Perez's men suggested they go to the Farnsworth store. Bowen couldn't dissuade them. Bowen provided 12 bales of hay and hauled 4 hecks of corn, which is the equivalent of 11 bushels, from his own crib, with the understanding that they would settle in the morning. Next morning, Saturday, I went up to the store before breakfast. Perez had sent 2 armed men to my home to bring me to him, but I missed them on the way. Arriving at the store, he told me he wanted to talk to me. So we went into the store and he asked me if I knew anything about who had given him the information to Talamantes, the constitutionalist leader, then at La Ascensión, which led to the capture and execution of Jose Parra, a Red Flag chief, last July. I told him, and that truthfully, that I knew absolutely nothing of the affair. He said he had reason to believe that I knew about the matter. He also said that there were 3 implicated in the affair, 1 Mormon, 1 American, and 1 Mexican, and that I was the Mormon and operated the whole business. I protested and maintained my innocence, but to no avail. He told me that he had orders from General Castillo to arrest me and either execute me immediately or take me before him, and he would do it. I was then put under guard of 3 armed men and told that I could go home and get a horse and saddle and such necessary equipment as I might need to accompany them. Bowen walked home, accompanied by 3 armed riders. Sending Anson Jr. to saddle his mule, he went into the house to make preparations to go with the guards. They never let him out of their sight, following him from room to room with guns at the ready. I told Theresa and Julia what the deal was. I told them I didn't know where I was going or when I would be back, if ever. But I reminded them of the promise Elder Ivans had given me in his letter. Theresa said that before she came back to Mexico from Utah, her uncle Israel Barlow had given her a patriarchal blessing and told her that none of her family would be killed. So when I bade them all goodbye, we had those 2 promises to cling to. I kissed my folks goodbye, and with tears streaming from their faces, I mounted my mule, not knowing my fate, but trusting in the Lord for deliverance. Mildred, who was 15 years old at the time, later wrote, "We will never forget watching him ride away on his mule. He didn't even have a horse at that time, wondering if we would ever see him again. Mama, Theresa, had great faith that he would be all right, and we all fasted and prayed. I think Mama fasted all the time he was gone. She decided that work was the best medicine to keep us from worrying so much and to make the time pass faster. So we papered the hall and cleaned the whole house from top to bottom. We constantly prayed for his safety." Lorna also remembered. The 2 families met at Aunt Theresa's home and prayed together, praying for Papa. The families also prayed separately. We prayed individually. The ward prayed. Everyone was praying. Bowen and the bandits rode as far as Casas Grandes on Saturday, where later Bishop Bentley came from Colonia Juarez to plead my case. Brother Bentley had an interview with Perez, declaring to him that I was not guilty and telling him that I had always taken a neutral stand in all the affairs of this conflict. All this had no effect on Perez, who dismissed us very abruptly, declaring that I must pay the penalty with my life, as I had been the cause of the death of many of their men, and thereby made many widows and orphans. Bowen spent that night on the cold floor with only a saddle blanket and a blanket he had brought from home and his overcoat, and an intoxicated guard watching his every move. The next morning, Brother Morley Black, who spoke good Spanish, went to see Perez to plead for Bowen's release. When he returned to Bowen's cell, Morley encouraged him to be of good cheer because Perez had offered to release him in return for money. Bowen relates, Brother Black and I went and had a talk with Perez and asked him what his price was. After repeating the gravity of the offense many times, he said he was doing us a great favor by letting me off at all, and that the price he had fixed was 2,000 pesos. I told him that it was absolutely impossible to pay that amount, as there was not that amount of money in both colonies. We also explained to him that the trains, as he well knew, had not been running for more than 6 months, and that what hay and grain had not been stolen from us was still piled up and no sale for anything. Consequently, there was no money in circulation. After more discussion, he finally said that the lowest sum that he would consider at all was 1,000 pesos. We told him that we could not raise that amount. He then dismissed us and gave orders to saddle up and be on the move. The Red Flaggers and Bowen rode south along the Casas Grandes River as far as the Anchondo's ranch, 9 miles upriver from Casas Grandes. It rained nearly all night, Bowen recalled, but we were in the house and dry. The next morning, Monday, November 17th, the company rode southward and then west until they arrived at San Diego, where they took possession of the hacienda of Don Luis Terrazas, which had been abandoned. In his own words, this is what happened that night. Nothing more was said to me until that night after dark, when Perez called me out from the men around the campfire and said he wanted to talk to me. He also called one of his chiefs, third in command of the company, to hear what was said. He then asked me what I was going to do. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said to pay the money he had spoke to Brother Black and me about in Casas Grandes. I told him that it was utterly impossible to raise that amount. He said, "What do you value your life at?" I told him that I valued it more than the whole world, but that I could not give the world to save it, as it did not belong to me. So I could not give it to save it. He then took his chief aside and they held a whispered conversation for about 5 minutes, then returned to me and ordered me to bring my bed and equipments and to make it down beside him, the chief. I knew something was unusual and so felt very uneasy. I did not sleep any, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, the guard rapped on the door and said the time was up. The chief woke 3 other men and then he spoke to me and said, "Come on." I asked him where we were going, but all he said was, "Come on." While I was preparing to accompany them, they loaded their guns. They took me out and around the north side of the hacienda and out of the west gate. Having gone about 300 meters down into the hollow, we stopped under a large cottonwood tree. The chief said, "This is the place." I asked him what they were going to do. He said, "Execute you." I asked him what for, and he said it was the colonel's orders and that he had to carry them out. Then he asked me if I would rather have my eyes blindfolded or if I would prefer to die with them open. I told him to suit himself, whereupon he told me to stand with my back against the tree. I did so, and the 4 men lined up in front of me with their guns pointed at my breast. Later, he wrote, how vividly came to mind the letter from Elder Ivans of the Quorum of the 12, in which he seemed to foresee what some of us would have to pass through. I clung tenaciously to the promise he gave me, yet I was very much frightened. I knew the saints were praying for me. I knew my family was praying, and I was praying as I never prayed before. It was a desperate moment, and my heart was sinking within me. And yet I was clinging to the promise made me and had a lingering belief that in some way it would be fulfilled. My time seemed almost to an end, but I prayed all the time and told the Lord of the promise of his servant a great many times. Then the lieutenant counted, uno, dos, and just as I thought he was going to say tres, he asked me what I was willing to do. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said, make us a proposition. I told him I was willing to go to Colonia Juarez and try to raise 100 or 200 pesos. He said he would submit my proposition to Perez in the morning, but gave no assurance that he would accept it and that he might carry out the sentence at sunrise. As we marched back to the hacienda, I was trembling with fear more than from the cold. Morning came, and I was given some beef to eat, which I broiled over the fire. Then I was taken to Perez to learn of his decision. We talked with Perez, and he said he would accept the offer of 200 pesos, and that he would send a man with me to Colonia Juarez and bring the money back. 4 armed men accompanied me to Colonia Juarez, where we found Bishop Bentley, and he and Brother Walzer went from house to house and got what money they could, the store making up the deficiency. A very grateful and much relieved Bowen handed the 200 pesos to the Mexican guards. They thanked me, he said, shook hands, and went back to San Diego. Bowen was free at last. He thanked Bishop Bentley and the people of Colonia Juarez. Then he said, I got on my mule and went back to Colonia Dublan, where family were waiting. When he rode up to his home, there was much rejoicing, he said. Bowen was so fatigued that he had to go to bed and was unable to work for 3 days. It was a week before he was able to write a report of his ordeal to Elder Ivans. In it, he ended his narrative by saying, I have no desire to have it repeated, and thank the Lord for my deliverance. I'm so grateful for all of you who write and preserve your own life story and that of our ancestors. I'm grateful for the faith and the faithfulness of Grandpa Bowen and his wives and children. I know that Jesus Christ lives and loves us and will protect and guide us like he did with Bowen and his family, if we are faithful like they were. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Now I would like to open it up for anybody that would like to comment about it.